Captain Marcus Reed had been shot at by professionals from 17 different species, but he'd never been nervous about protecting someone until he met Ambassador Lyra Thess. It wasn't her appearance that unsettled him, though the Valerian diplomat was undeniably striking. Like all her species, she stood 7 feet tall with elegant proportions that seemed designed by someone who understood both grace and strength. Her skin held the pale luminescence that marked Valerian nobility, and her silver hair moved with its own subtle motion, responding to emotions in ways that human hair never could. What made Marcus nervous was the way she looked at things, as if she could see possibilities and consequences that escaped everyone else in the room. "Captain Reed," she said as they concluded their security briefing, her voice carrying the musical quality that made Valerian's speech sound like carefully composed poetry. "I understand you have concerns about the venue for tomorrow's negotiations." "Yes, ma'am. The Grand Assembly Hall has 17 separate access points, limited cover for defensive positions, and sight lines that favor long-range attacks." Marcus consulted his tactical display. "I've requested additional security personnel, but the Neutral Zone Authority is concerned about creating an atmosphere of militarization." An understandable concern. "These talks are delicate enough without making our security arrangements appear threatening." Lyra Thess moved to the window of her quarters, looking out at the sprawling complex of Kepler Station. "However, I defer to your professional expertise in matters of protection." Marcus studied her profile, noting the subtle tension in her posture that suggested she was more worried about the negotiations than she was letting on. "Ma'am, if I may ask, what's your assessment of the threat level from extremist groups?" "Higher than my government is willing to acknowledge publicly." Lyra Thess turned from the window, and Marcus saw something in her large violet eyes that looked like fear carefully controlled. "There are factions on both sides who prefer war to peace, Captain. They view these negotiations as betrayal rather than progress." "Specific intelligence about planned attacks?" "Nothing concrete. But I've received communications that suggest some of my own people consider my diplomatic efforts to be treason against Valerian purity." Her hair shifted to darker silver, a color Marcus had learned indicated stress. "Apparently, negotiating with lesser species is seen as contamination of our noble heritage." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd dealt with species supremacists before, but hearing it applied to someone like Lyra Thess, who had spent 3 years working to prevent a war that would kill millions, made him angry in ways that surprised him. "Ma'am, in my professional opinion, any species that considers diplomacy to be contamination isn't as noble as they think they are." Lyra Thess looked at him with surprise, her hair shifting to a lighter shade that Marcus had learned meant curiosity or mild pleasure. "That's a remarkably progressive view for a human military officer, Captain. I've been around the galaxy enough to know that nobility isn't about genetics or birth, it's about what you choose to do when the stakes matter." An interesting philosophy. Most species seem to believe that worth is inherent rather than earned. Most species are wrong about a lot of things. Lyra Thess smiled then, the first genuine expression of amusement Marcus had seen from her since taking the assignment. "Indeed they are, Captain. Indeed they are." The next morning brought exactly the kind of complications Marcus had been dreading. As they prepared for the opening session of the peace talks, intelligence reports flooded in about suspicious activity around the station. 3 unauthorized ships detected on the perimeter, reported Lieutenant Saracen, Marcus's second-in-command. They're maintaining legal distances but monitoring all communications traffic. Faction affiliations? Unknown. The ships bear no identifying marks, but their configurations suggest both human and Valerian origins. Marcus felt cold certainty settling in his stomach. Joint operation. Extremists from both sides working together to sabotage the talks. "That's impossible," said Commander Torres, the station's chief of security. "Human and Valerian extremist groups hate each other almost as much as they hate the peace process." "Hate makes strange allies," Marcus replied, checking his weapon and communication gear. "Especially when they share a common enemy." As they made their way to the Grand Assembly Hall, Marcus found himself walking closer to Lyra Thess than protocol strictly required. She noticed, of course, Valerians were trained from childhood to be aware of spatial relationships and social positioning. Nervous, Captain? Prepared, ma'am. There's a difference. Is there? I confess I find the distinction somewhat academic at the moment. Marcus glanced at her, noting the way her hair had shifted to pale silver, the color he'd learned indicated suppressed anxiety. Ma'am, if it helps, you should know that you're the most competent diplomat I've ever had the privilege to protect. If anyone can make these talks work, it's you. Thank you, Captain. That means more than you might realize. They reached the Grand Assembly Hall to find it filled with representatives from dozens of species, all gathered to witness what could be either a historic peace accord or the final breakdown of diplomatic relations between humans and Valerians. Marcus positioned himself where he could monitor all the access points while maintaining visual contact with Lyrithess. Around the hall, he could see other security personnel from various governments, all trying to balance protection with the appearance of diplomatic civility. Opening statements will begin in 10 minutes, announced the session moderator, a neutral Centaurian diplomat whose species specialized in conflict mediation. Marcus felt his tactical awareness heighten as the moment approached. If extremists were planning to disrupt the talks, the opening statements would provide maximum symbolic impact. Captain, came Lieutenant Chen's voice through his earpiece, we've lost contact with perimeter security. All 3 of those suspicious ships have gone dark. Understood. All units to full alert. Marcus scanned the assembly hall again, noting details that had seemed routine minutes earlier but now felt ominous. The lighting was positioned to create dramatic effect but also provided concealment for potential shooters. The acoustics were designed to carry voices clearly but would also amplify confusion in an emergency. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings, the moderator announced, we are gathered today to witness a historic moment in galactic diplomacy. Ambassador Lyrithess of the Valerian Empire will present the opening statement for her delegation. Lyrithess rose with fluid grace, moving to the speaker's podium with the kind of composed dignity that made her seem like she was floating rather than walking. Her speech was eloquent, passionate, and completely sincere, a call for understanding between species that had been enemies for too long. Marcus found himself listening to her words instead of focusing purely on security, caught up in her vision of a galaxy where differences were celebrated rather than feared. That's when he saw the glint of metal in the upper gallery. Training took over. Marcus moved without conscious thought, throwing himself across the space between his position and the podium just as the energy bolt meant for Lyrithess seared through the air where she had been standing. He hit her with enough force to knock them both to the ground, his body covering hers as more shots rang out from multiple positions around the hall. Pain exploded through his back as something sharp, a blade rather than an energy weapon, found the gap in his armor. Stay down, he gasped, pressing himself against Lyrithess as chaos erupted around them. Multiple shooters, coordinated attack. Captain, you're hurt, she said, her voice carrying a note of concern that seemed out of place given the circumstances. I'm fine. Just stay down until my team can. Marcus felt his strength failing as blood loss began to take its toll. The blade had found something vital, and he could feel his life beginning to ebb away. Captain. Lyrithess's voice was sharp with alarm. Captain, stay with me. As darkness began to close around his vision, Marcus realized he was bleeding on her pale, luminescent skin. Human blood on a Valerian noble. If he survived this, she would be ruined by the contact. But at least she would survive. As consciousness faded, Marcus heard Lyrithess calling for medical assistance in a voice that carried more emotion than any Valerian diplomat should show in public. He'd done his job. The rest was up to her. Marcus drifted back to consciousness in what was clearly a medical facility, though not one designed for human physiology. The room was too large, the ceiling too high, and the equipment hummed with harmonics that suggested Valerian biotechnology. Through his half-open eyes, he could see monitoring devices that resembled crystalline sculptures, their faceted surfaces displaying vital signs and patterns of light that shifted like aurora. He's awakening, said a voice with the melodic quality that marked Valerian medical personnel. Vital signs are stabilizing, but the damage was severe. Another few minutes and we would have lost him. How long has he been unconscious? That was Lyrithes's voice, though it carried a strain Marcus had never heard before. 18 hours. The blade punctured his liver and nicked a major artery. We had to perform extensive reconstruction using biosynthesis techniques adapted for human physiology. Marcus tried to speak, but only managed a weak sound that drew immediate attention from both speakers. Captain Reed, Lyrithus appeared in his field of vision, leaning over his bed with an expression of concern that seemed entirely inappropriate for a Valerian noble. Don't try to move. You've been severely injured. The negotiations, Marcus managed to whisper. Are you safe? I'm safe because of you, she replied, her hair shifting to colors Marcus couldn't interpret through his medication-induced haze. The attackers have been captured, and security has been increased throughout the station. Good. Marcus tried to assess his condition, noting the various tubes and monitoring devices attached to his body. How bad is it? You nearly died, Lyrithus said bluntly. The medical team says you lost over half your blood volume. If we hadn't gotten you to surgery immediately. She didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus could read the implications in her expression. Ma'am, I need to ask you something important. Marcus struggled to focus through the pain medication. My blood, it got on your skin during the attack. In Valerian culture, that means I am considered contaminated by contact with a lesser species, Lyrithus finished, her voice carrying no emotion at all. Yes, Captain. I am aware of the implications. Marcus felt sick, and not just from his injuries. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to protect you. And you succeeded. Admirably. But your career, your position in society, are forfeit, Lyrithus said matter-of-factly. The moment your blood touched my skin, I became untouchable according to Valerian law. I can never return to the Empire, never hold diplomatic rank, never marry within my species. Marcus stared at her, horror replacing the relief he'd felt at surviving. Because of me. Because of the choices we both made. Lyrithus moved closer to his bed, and Marcus could see something fierce in her violet eyes. Captain, I need you to understand something. I am not grateful because you saved my life. I am grateful because you proved something I had begun to believe was impossible. What's that? That worth has nothing to do with species or breeding or the accidents of genetics. That nobility is about actions, not bloodlines. Her hair shifted to brilliant silver, a color Marcus had never seen before. You are more noble than any Valerian I have ever known. That doesn't change what happened to you. Your people. My people, Lyrithus interrupted, have made a fundamental error in judgment. They believe that purity is more important than principle. That tradition is more valuable than truth. Marcus tried to sit up, gasping as pain shot through his torso. Ma'am, you can't. I can't what? Choose my own values over those imposed by birth? Lyrithus gently pressed him back against the pillows. Captain, you threw yourself between me and death without a moment's hesitation. You bled for me, nearly died for me, asked for nothing in return except that I survive. It was my job. No. Your job was to protect me from assassination attempts. Your job was not to sacrifice your life for someone whose species considers you inferior. Marcus felt confusion mixing with the pain medication. I don't understand. You acted with honor, Captain. Perfect, absolute honor, in a way that my own people seem to have forgotten. Lyrithus's expression grew determined. And I will not allow that honor to be diminished by the prejudices of those who have never faced such a choice. What are you saying? I'm saying that if my people cannot recognize nobility when they see it, then perhaps it's time for me to choose new people. Before Marcus could respond, the medical bay's doors opened to admit a group of figures in elaborate Valerian formal wear. Marcus recognized the ceremonial robes of high-ranking nobility, though he couldn't identify specific individuals. Ambassador Lyrithus, said the apparent leader, a stern-faced Valerian whose hair was the pure white of extreme age. You will return to the Empire immediately for purification protocols. High Counselor Thexfar, Lyra Thess replied without moving from Marcus's bedside. I decline your generous offer. This is not an offer. This is a direct command from the High Council of Valeries Prime, which I respectfully decline to obey. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus could feel the weight of cultural taboos being shattered by Lyra Thess's quiet defiance. You cannot refuse a direct command from the High Council, Counselor Thexfar said, his voice carrying shock and disbelief. You are a citizen of the Empire, bound by our laws and traditions. I was a citizen of the Empire, Lyra Thess corrected. Now I am simply someone who chooses to stand beside a person of genuine worth, regardless of what small minds might think of that choice. The contamination has clearly affected your judgment, another counselor said. The humans' inferior genetics have demonstrated qualities that our people seem to have lost, Lyra Thess interrupted, her voice carrying authority that silenced the entire delegation. Honor. Selflessness. The willingness to sacrifice everything for principle. Marcus watched in amazement as the ambassador he'd been hired to protect transformed into something fierce and uncompromising. Lyra Thess, Counselor Thexfar said, his voice growing dangerous, you are walking away from everything, your title, your inheritance, your place in society. For what? For this creature? For this hero, Lyra Thess corrected. For someone who understood that protecting the innocent matters more than preserving prejudice. And when the Empire marks you as exile? When you can never return home? Then I'll build a new home with people who understand the difference between honor and bigotry. The Valerian delegation exchanged glances that suggested they had not expected this level of resistance. You have 24 hours to reconsider, Counselor Thexfar said finally. After that, the exile becomes permanent. Then consider it permanent now, Lyra Thess replied without hesitation. As the delegation left in shocked silence, Marcus stared at the woman who had just thrown away everything for the sake of principle. Why? He asked quietly. Because, Lyra Thess said, her hair shifting to warm gold, you showed me what it means to choose duty over comfort, service over safety, honor over convenience. I showed you. You showed all of us, Captain. The question is whether we're wise enough to learn. The medical facility's recovery ward became an unexpected diplomatic venue over the next 3 days. Marcus watched from his bed as a steady stream of representatives from dozens of species came to visit Ambassador Lyra Thess, ostensibly to inquire about her health but actually to understand what her exile from the Valerian Empire meant for the ongoing peace negotiations. The Centaurian delegation is concerned about the precedent, Lyra Thess explained during one of their quiet moments between official visitors. They're worried that other species might question traditional authority structures if they see a Valerian noble successfully defying the High Council. Are they right to be worried? Marcus asked, still amazed that she had chosen exile over returning to her people. I hope so. Lyra Thess smiled, her hair shifting to the warm silver that Marcus had learned indicated contentment. Traditional authority structures that demand bigotry as the price of belonging deserve to be questioned. Marcus studied her face, noting the way her expression had changed over the past few days. The formal mask of diplomatic composure had been replaced by something more genuine, more alive. Do you regret it? Walking away from everything you've known? I regret that it was necessary, Lyra Thess said carefully. I regret that my people value tradition over truth. But I don't regret choosing to stand with someone who proved that nobility has nothing to do with genetics. Your career, your family. My career was built on the premise that Valerians are inherently superior to other species. My family raised me to believe that contact with lesser beings was contamination. Her hair darkened slightly. If maintaining those relationships required accepting those lies, then perhaps they weren't worth maintaining. Before Marcus could respond, Lieutenant Chen entered the room with a datapad and an expression that suggested important news. Captain, ma'am, I have updates on the situation with the peace negotiations. Go ahead, Lieutenant. The human delegation has formally requested that Ambassador Lyra Thess continue representing Valerian interests, despite her exile status. They're arguing that her knowledge of both cultures makes her uniquely qualified to broker agreements. Marcus saw Lyrithes's eyes widen with surprise. The humans want me to continue as a diplomat? More than that, Chin continued. They're offering to sponsor your application for neutral citizenship through the Galactic Diplomatic Corps. You'd be representing peace negotiations as an independent mediator rather than as a Valerian noble. That's... Lyrithes paused, processing the implications. That's completely unprecedented. So is a Valerian noble choosing exile to stand with a human bodyguard, Marcus pointed out. Seems like a week for breaking precedents. Captain, Chin said, there's more. The Valerian Empire has sent a new delegation, but they're not here to negotiate peace. They're here to discredit anything Ambassador Lyrithes accomplishes. How? By arguing that her contamination by human contact has made her mentally unstable and therefore unfit to represent anyone in diplomatic negotiations. Marcus felt anger flare through him. They're going to claim she's insane because she chose principle over prejudice? It's a standard tactic when dealing with inconvenient truths, Lyrithes said, though her voice carried more amusement than concern. If you can't attack the argument, attack the person making it. Ma'am, Chin continued, there's something else. The new Valerian delegation is being led by High Counselor Thexfar himself. He's calling for a formal competency hearing to determine whether you're mentally fit to participate in galactic diplomacy. A trial, Marcus realized. They want to put her on trial for choosing to help humans. Essentially, yes. But Captain. Chen's expression grew serious. You'll have to testify. They're arguing that your influence somehow compromised her judgment, possibly through some kind of human psychological manipulation technique. Marcus stared at Chin in disbelief. They think I brainwashed her. They think you corrupted her with human weakness and emotional instability, Lyrithes corrected with dry humor. Apparently, choosing to honor someone who saved your life is a sign of mental deficiency in Valerian culture. That's insane. That's tradition, she replied. Which, as we've established, are not always the same thing. Over the following day, as Marcus recovered enough to move around the medical facility, he began to understand the magnitude of what Lyrithes was facing. The competency hearing would be conducted according to Valerian law, which meant that her decision to remain in contact with him would be treated as evidence of mental corruption. The irony, Lyrithes explained as they walked slowly through the facility's garden area, is that Valerian law considers emotional attachment to be a sign of weakness. The fact that I feel gratitude toward you, that I value your friendship, that I care about your welfare, all of that is seen as contamination by human irrationality. And if they rule you incompetent? Then any agreements I negotiate will be considered void, any alliances I help forge will be dismissed as the products of a diseased mind. Her hair shifted to darker shades. It would effectively end any hope of human Valerian peace for generations. Marcus stopped walking, the full implications hitting him like a physical blow. This is about more than just you. It always was, Captain. The moment you chose to protect me, you challenged everything the Empire believes about species hierarchy. The moment I chose to honor that sacrifice, I validated your challenge. So we've accidentally started a revolution. We've accidentally demonstrated that their fundamental assumptions about superiority and contamination are wrong. Lyrithes smiled sadly. Which, from their perspective, is the same thing. What do? We prove that choosing honor over prejudice isn't insanity, it's evolution. That evening, as Marcus struggled with the realization that his simple desire to protect someone had somehow become a threat to galactic peace, Lyrithes made an announcement that surprised everyone. I'm calling for public hearings, she told the assembled diplomatic corps. If the Valerian Empire wants to question my competency, they can do so in front of representatives from every species in the galaxy. Ma'am, Marcus said carefully, are you sure that's wise? Public hearings mean public scrutiny of everything that happened. Public hearings mean public examination of Valerian claims about species superiority, she corrected. They want to argue that I'm mentally deficient for valuing human nobility? Fine. Let them make that argument in front of the galaxy and see how it sounds. Marcus understood her strategy, but he also understood the risks. If she lost the competency hearing, she wouldn't just be exiled, she'd be declared insane and everything she'd worked for would be discredited. What if they win? He asked. Then at least the galaxy will see exactly what we're fighting against, Lyrithess replied. And they'll understand why it was worth fighting. As they prepared for what might be the most important trial in galactic diplomatic history, Marcus realized that his choice to protect one diplomat had somehow become a test of whether the galaxy was ready to move beyond the prejudices that had defined interspecies relations for centuries. No pressure at all. The hearing convened in the Grand Assembly Hall where the original attack had taken place, transformed now into a courtroom that would determine the future of interspecies diplomacy. Marcus sat in the witness section, still recovering from his injuries but determined to testify on Lyrithess's behalf. Around him, representatives from 47 different species had gathered to observe what the media was calling the trial of the century. High Counselor Thexfar stood at the prosecution podium with the rigid bearing of someone convinced of his absolute righteousness. His opening statement was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that nonetheless made his position crystal clear. Honored delegates, he began, his voice carrying the harmonic authority of Valerian high nobility, we are here to address a tragedy of contamination that threatens the very foundations of galactic civilization. Marcus felt his jaw clench as Thexfar continued. Ambassador Lyrithess was once a promising representative of Valerian excellence, educated in our finest institutions, trained in our most advanced diplomatic protocols. But exposure to human emotional instability has corrupted her judgment to the point where she can no longer distinguish between duty and sentiment. The evidence is clear. She has chosen to remain in contact with a human whose genetic material has literally contaminated her sacred person. She has defied direct orders from the High Council. Most disturbing of all, she has begun to exhibit the kind of irrational attachment that humans mistake for virtue. Thexfar gestured toward Marcus with obvious distaste. This human soldier performed his assigned function adequately, nothing more. Yet Ambassador Lyrithess has elevated this routine professional service into some kind of mythical heroism, demonstrating the kind of emotional excess that marks human psychological dysfunction. Around the hall, Marcus could see representatives from various species taking notes, their expressions ranging from interest to skepticism to outright alarm. The contamination has progressed to the point where Ambassador Lyrithess genuinely believes that a human, a species barely evolved beyond primitive tribalism, has demonstrated qualities superior to those of Valerian nobility. This is not diplomacy, honored delegates. This is madness. When Lyrithess rose to present her defense, Marcus felt the entire hall focusing on her with intense attention. She moved to the podium with the same grace she'd always shown, but there was something different now, a confidence that seemed to come from absolute certainty rather than diplomatic training. Honored delegates, she began, High Counselor Thexfar is absolutely correct about one thing. I have been contaminated. The murmur that ran through the assembly was audible. I have been contaminated by the radical idea that nobility has nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with choices. I have been infected by the dangerous notion that heroism is measured by actions rather than bloodlines. Most corrosively of all, I have been exposed to the concept that worth is earned rather than inherited. Marcus watched as Lyrithess commanded the room with quiet authority. Captain Marcus Reed threw himself between me and an assassin's blade without hesitation, without calculation, without regard for his own survival. He bled for someone whose people consider his species inferior. He nearly died protecting someone who, according to his culture's military protocols, was just another assignment. And when he learned that his sacrifice had contaminated me according to Valerian law, his first concern was not for his own survival but for the damage his protection had caused to my social standing. Lyrithess paused, letting the implications settle. If that is madness, then I choose madness over sanity. If that is contamination, then I choose contamination over purity. If that is weakness, then I choose weakness over strength. But I do not believe those are the correct classifications. I believe that recognizing genuine nobility when you see it, regardless of its source, is the foundation of wisdom. I believe that honoring sacrifice, regardless of who makes it, is the essence of justice. High Counselor Thexfar rose from his seat. Ambassador, do you seriously expect this assembly to believe that a human soldier is superior to Valyrian nobility? I expect this assembly to judge for themselves, Lyra Thess replied calmly. Captain Reed, would you please stand? Marcus rose somewhat unsteadily, still feeling the effects of his injuries. Around the hall, representatives leaned forward to study the human who had somehow become the center of a galactic controversy. Captain, Lyra Thess said, please tell the assembly exactly what went through your mind when you saw the assassin's weapon aimed at me. Marcus looked around the hall at faces from dozens of species, all waiting for his answer. He had never wanted to be at the center of diplomatic controversy, had never intended his actions to challenge anyone's cultural assumptions. I saw someone trying to kill a person I was assigned to protect, he said simply. So I stopped them. And the consequences to yourself? Weren't relevant. My job was to keep you alive. Even though my people consider yours inferior? Marcus felt every eye in the hall focused on him. Ma'am, I've met individuals from a lot of species who were good people and individuals from a lot of species who were bastards. Species doesn't seem to be the determining factor. A ripple of something, amusement, approval, ran through the assembly. Captain, High Counselor Thexfar interjected, are you seriously suggesting that there are no meaningful differences between species? That evolution and genetic development are irrelevant to capability and worth? I'm suggesting that the only meaningful differences are the ones individuals choose to make, Marcus replied. Some people choose to be decent, others choose to be cruel. Some choose to help, others choose to hurt. What they look like or where they come from doesn't seem to predict which choice they'll make. But surely you recognize that some species are more advanced than others? I recognize that some individuals are smarter, stronger, or more skilled than others. But I've never seen any evidence that those qualities are distributed by species rather than by individual variation. Marcus paused, then decided to push further. For instance, High Counselor, you're arguing that genetic heritage determines worth. But Ambassador Lyra Thess has the same genetic heritage as you, and she's demonstrating wisdom while you're demonstrating bigotry. How does your theory account for that? The silence that followed was absolute. High Counselor Thexfar's expression went through several rapid changes before settling on cold fury. You dare to question the wisdom of the Valyrian High Council? I'm questioning the wisdom of judging people by their genetics instead of their actions, Marcus replied. Which seems like a pretty reasonable thing to question. And this, Thexfar said, turning to address the assembly, is exactly the kind of contamination I warned you about. This human has so corrupted Ambassador Lyra Thess's judgment that she now considers his primitive philosophies to be wisdom. No, Lyra Thess said, stepping forward. This human has demonstrated through his actions that those philosophies are wisdom. The question is whether the rest of us are wise enough to recognize it. As the hearing continued into its second day, Marcus realized that they weren't just defending Lyra Thess's competency. They were putting the entire concept of species-based prejudice on trial. And the verdict would determine whether the galaxy was ready to move beyond the assumptions that had shaped interspecies relations for millennia. The second day of the hearing brought unexpected allies and devastating revelations. Marcus watched from the witness section as Ambassador Kethran of the Centaurian Federation took the stand to testify on Lyra Thess's behalf. I have worked with Ambassador Lyra Thess for 3 years, the insectoid diplomat said, his translation device rendering his complex chemical communications into precise English. In that time, I have observed her demonstrate wisdom, integrity, and diplomatic skill that surpassed many of my own species' most experienced negotiators. But surely, High Counselor Thexfar interjected, you cannot deny that her recent behavior represents a fundamental change in judgment? On the contrary, Ambassador Kethran replied, her recent behavior represents the logical extension of the principles she has always demonstrated. Ambassador Lyra Thess has consistently chosen the difficult right over the easy wrong. Her defense of Captain Reed's actions is entirely consistent with that pattern. Similar testimony came from representatives of 6 other species, all of whom had worked with Lyra Thess and all of whom rejected the idea that her choices represented mental incompetence. But the real shock came when Dr. Sarah Kim, the station's chief xenopsychologist, presented her analysis of the mental contamination claims. I have conducted extensive psychological evaluations of both Ambassador Lyrithess and Captain Reed, Dr. Kim testified. My findings directly contradict the Valerian Empire's assertions about contamination effects. She activated a holographic display showing brain scan comparisons. Valerian neurology shows distinct patterns when influenced by external psychological manipulation. Ambassador Lyrithess shows no such patterns. Her decisions appear to be the result of normal cognitive processing applied to accurate information about Captain Reed's actions. What about claims of emotional instability? Thexfar asked. Ambassador Lyrithess demonstrates emotional responses well within normal parameters for her species. In fact, her psychological profile suggests unusual emotional stability and resistance to manipulation. Dr. Kim paused, then continued with obvious reluctance. However, my analysis did reveal evidence of systematic psychological conditioning designed to suppress natural empathic responses and enforce species supremacist beliefs. The hall fell silent. Are you suggesting, asked the neutral moderator, that Valerian education includes psychological manipulation? I'm stating that Valerian neural patterns show clear evidence of artificial conditioning designed to enhance in-group loyalty while suppressing empathic responses to other species, Dr. Kim said carefully. This conditioning appears to be implemented during early childhood development. The implications of her testimony sent shock waves through the assembly. Marcus could see Valerian representatives conferring urgently among themselves while other species delegations took frantic notes. Dr. Kim, High Counselor Thexfar said with dangerous calm, are you seriously suggesting that Valerian child-rearing practices constitute psychological manipulation? I'm presenting scientific evidence about neural conditioning patterns. The interpretation of that evidence is beyond my scope as a researcher. But you're claiming that Ambassador Lyrithess's current behavior represents her natural state, while her previous adherence to Valerian cultural norms was the result of artificial conditioning? That appears to be consistent with the neurological evidence, yes. Marcus watched Lyrithess's expression during this exchange, noting how she seemed less surprised than vindicated by Dr. Kim's findings. Ambassador, the neutral moderator asked, how do you respond to these psychological evaluations? Lyrithess rose with composed dignity. They explain a great deal about my own experience. For most of my life, I felt disconnected from the beliefs I was taught to hold. I could recite the principles of Valerian superiority, but they never felt true in any meaningful sense. And now? Now I understand why. Those beliefs were never mine, they were imposed through systematic conditioning designed to override my natural empathic responses. Her hair shifted to clear silver. Meeting Captain Reed didn't contaminate my judgment, it freed my judgment from artificial constraints. This is preposterous, Thexfar declared. You're claiming that Valerian civilization is built on psychological manipulation? I'm claiming that any civilization that requires artificial conditioning to maintain its core beliefs might want to examine whether those beliefs are worth maintaining, Lyrithess replied. The hearing recessed amid unprecedented chaos as delegations from dozens of species demanded private consultations with their respective governments. During the recess, Marcus found himself alone with Lyrithess in a secure conference room, both of them trying to process what Dr. Kim's testimony meant. Did you know, he asked, about the conditioning? I suspected something, Lyrithess admitted. The disconnect between what I was taught to feel and what I actually felt was too profound to be natural. But I never imagined the scope of it. So when you defended my actions, I was acting on suppressed empathy that finally had the chance to surface. She smiled sadly. In a very real sense, you didn't just save my life, Marcus. You saved my mind. By bleeding on you? By demonstrating that the conditioning was wrong. That other species were capable of the kind of nobility I'd been taught was uniquely Valerian. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. What happens now? Now we find out whether the galaxy is ready to question its assumptions about genetic superiority and cultural conditioning. When the hearing reconvened, High Counselor Thexfar had clearly decided on a new strategy. Even accepting Dr. Kim's questionable analysis, he said, the fact remains that Ambassador Lyra Thess has violated fundamental Valerian law by maintaining contact with a human whose genetic material contaminated her person. The contamination laws serve a specific purpose, to maintain the genetic and cultural purity that makes Valerian civilization superior to others. Regardless of psychological theories, those laws exist for the protection of our entire species. High Counselor, the neutral moderator asked, can you explain the scientific basis for these contamination laws? Thexfar hesitated. The laws are based on thousands of years of tradition and cultural wisdom. But what is the specific mechanism by which contact with other species causes contamination? The mixing of genetic material creates psychological instability and cultural confusion. Has this been scientifically verified? Another hesitation. The wisdom of our ancestors. With respect, Dr. Kim interjected, I've found no evidence of any harmful effects from interspecies contact. In fact, my research suggests that such contact typically enhances cognitive flexibility and emotional intelligence. Marcus watched Thexfar struggle with the realization that his entire legal framework was based on assumptions that couldn't be scientifically supported. The laws exist, he said finally. Regardless of their scientific basis, they are the foundation of Valerian society. Laws based on false premises, Lyra Thess said quietly, are not laws worth obeying. You cannot simply dismiss thousands of years of tradition. I can when that tradition requires me to treat genuine heroes as inferior beings, she replied with steel in her voice. I can when that tradition demands that I ignore nobility because it comes from the wrong genetics. And this is exactly the contamination we warned against, Thexfar said desperately. She has lost all respect for Valerian wisdom, all connection to her own people's values. I have gained respect for actual wisdom and actual values, Lyra Thess corrected. Which, it turns out, have nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with choices. The final day of the hearing brought a parade of character witnesses, scientific experts, and cultural analysts, all testifying to the fundamental question at the heart of the case, was Lyra Thess mentally competent, or had her contact with Marcus somehow corrupted her judgment? But Marcus realized that the real question was deeper than that. The galaxy was deciding whether species-based prejudice was a foundation worth preserving or a mistake worth correcting. When the time came for closing arguments, Lyra Thess spoke with the kind of quiet authority that commanded absolute attention. Honored delegates, you have heard extensive testimony about contamination, conditioning, and competency. But the real issue is much simpler than that. 3 weeks ago, a human soldier chose to risk his life for someone whose people consider his species inferior. He made that choice not because it was required, not because it would benefit him, but because it was right. I have been accused of mental contamination for recognizing that choice as heroic. If acknowledging genuine nobility is contamination, then contaminate me. If honoring authentic sacrifice is madness, then I choose madness. But I believe that recognizing worth when you see it, regardless of its source, is not contamination, it's wisdom. And I believe that a galaxy capable of such wisdom is worth building, even if it means abandoning the prejudices that have defined us for millennia. As the assembly prepared to vote on her competency, Marcus realized that Lyra Thess had transformed a hearing about her mental fitness into a referendum on the future of interspecies relations. The vote would determine not just her fate, but whether the galaxy was ready to judge individuals by their actions rather than their genetics. In other words, whether the traditions she had broken were worth preserving or worth abandoning. Vote was not even close. By a margin of 38-9, the Galactic Assembly declared Ambassador Lyra Thess mentally competent and rejected the Valerian Empire's contamination claims. More importantly, they formally censured the Empire for attempting to use psychological conditioning disguised as cultural tradition to maintain species-based prejudice. Marcus watched from the witness section as Lyra Thess accepted the Assembly's decision with the same composed dignity she had shown throughout the trial. But he could see the relief in her hair patterns, the way they shifted to warm gold that spoke of vindication and hope. Furthermore, announced the neutral moderator, this assembly formally recognizes Dr. Lyra Thess as an independent diplomatic mediator qualified to represent peace negotiations between any willing parties. The title change was significant, no longer ambassador representing the Valerian Empire, but Dr. Lyra Thess representing the cause of peace itself. High Counselor Thexfar, the moderator continued, the Assembly requests that the Valerian Empire reconsider its contamination laws in light of the scientific evidence presented during these proceedings. Thexfar's response was predictable. The Valerian Empire does not recognize the authority of this Assembly to dictate our internal cultural practices. Then the Valerian Empire will find itself increasingly isolated as other species move beyond the prejudices you insist on maintaining, Dr. Lyra Thess replied calmly. As the assembly session concluded and representatives began filing out, Marcus found himself facing an uncertain future. His injuries had healed enough for him to function, but his career as a security contractor was effectively over. No government would trust someone who had become the center of a galactic controversy about species prejudice. Captain Reed, Dr. Lyra Thess approached him with something that looked like nervous anticipation. I have a proposition for you. What kind of proposition? The Galactic Diplomatic Corps has offered me a permanent position mediating interspecies conflicts. The work would be dangerous, politically sensitive, and would require travel to some of the most unstable regions of known space. Marcus waited for the rest. I've been authorized to select my own security team, she continued. I can't imagine trusting that responsibility to anyone other than the person who has already demonstrated his willingness to protect what matters. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a partnership. Working together to prove that the principles we defended in this hearing can actually function in the real world. Marcus considered the offer. It would mean spending his career protecting someone who had already proved she would risk everything for her principles. It would mean traveling to conflict zones where species prejudice ran so deep that their mere presence might trigger violence. It would also mean working alongside someone who had shown him that nobility really was about choices rather than birth, that worthiness was earned through actions rather than inherited through genetics. Dr. Lyra Thess, he said formally, I would be honored to accept that position. Her smile was radiant, her hair shifting to colors Marcus had never seen before, joy mixed with anticipation and something deeper. There is one more thing, she said quietly. Something personal rather than professional. What's that? Valerian culture has a concept called soul bonding, a formal recognition that two individuals have demonstrated such compatibility and mutual trust that they choose to commit their lives to each other's welfare. Marcus felt his heartbeat accelerate. Are you? I'm asking if you would consider such a bond with me. Not romantic in the human sense, but something deeper, a formal acknowledgement that we choose to stand together regardless of what the universe throws at us. Marcus stared at her, understanding the magnitude of what she was offering. In Valerian culture, soul bonding was the highest form of relationship, transcending even marriage in its level of commitment. You're asking a human to participate in a sacred Valerian ceremony? I'm asking my partner to formalize what we've already proven, that the bonds between individuals matter more than the barriers between species. What would that mean, practically speaking? It would mean that we're family, Marcus. Chosen family, committed to each other's success and survival. Her hair shifted to the warm silver that indicated deep emotion. It would mean that neither of us ever has to face the universe alone again. Marcus thought about everything that had happened since that first assassination attempt. The way Lyra Thess had chosen exile over abandoning him. The way she had defended his actions even when it cost her everything. The way she had transformed a competency hearing into a galaxy-wide examination of prejudice and tradition. There's just one problem, he said. What's that? According to your people's laws, I'm still a source of contamination. Soul bonding with me would make you even more untouchable than you already are. Marcus, Lyra Thess said with gentle amusement, I think we've already established that my people's laws are based on false premises. Fair point. Besides, she continued, I've discovered that being untouchable according to prejudiced laws is actually quite liberating. It frees you to make choices based on what's right rather than what's expected. Marcus looked at this remarkable woman who had given up everything to stand with him, who had challenged her entire civilization's assumptions about worth and nobility, who was now offering him something he had never dared imagine, a family bond that transcended species, politics, and prejudice. "Dr. Lyrith, he said formally, "I would be deeply honored to accept your offer of soul bonding. And I would be honored to call you family, Marcus Reed." 6 months later, Marcus stood guard outside a conference room on Rigel Station where Dr. Lyrith was mediating a territorial dispute between 3 species that had been fighting for generations. Through the reinforced windows, he could see her patiently working through cultural misunderstandings and competing claims with the same grace she had shown during her own trial. Their success rate was remarkable, 12 successful mediations out of 15 attempts, with the 3 failures due to external factors rather than diplomatic breakdown. Word was spreading throughout the galaxy that there was a team capable of bridging differences that had seemed impossible to resolve. "Captain Reed," came Lieutenant Chen's voice through his earpiece, "we have delegates arriving from the Andromedian Collective. They're requesting Dr. Lyrith's assistance with a first contact situation." "Acknowledged. Security status?" "Clean. Though I should mention, the collective delegates are apparently impressed that a human and Valerian have formed a working partnership. They're considering it evidence that their own species might be able to establish peaceful relations with the local galaxy." Marcus smiled. It seemed that their example was continuing to challenge assumptions about interspecies cooperation. Through their soul bond, he felt Lyrith's satisfaction as another breakthrough occurred in the mediation session. Whatever progress she was making, it was significant. As he had learned over their months of partnership, breaking traditions was often the first step toward building something better. And building something better, together, had turned out to be the most rewarding work either of them had ever done. The bodyguard who had shielded a diplomat with his life had become family with the woman who had broken all traditions to stand with him. And together, they were proving that the bonds between individuals really could transcend the barriers between species. One successful mediation at a time.